So let's get rolling. So DEIBD is our acronym for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization. If you are not familiar with the shorthand, and that's probably what we'll be using throughout here. What we want to start out with is a bit of an activity. So this is an answer garden activity you can access by going to tinyurl.com/DEIBD hyphen or dash U. And we just want you to enter in there what comes to mind when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, decolonization. Looks like it's also in the chat. And what do you think, Christine? I think multiple answers, probably okay if folks have, yeah.
Yep.
So take a couple minutes and, or even less, and throw it in there. Okay, inclusivity, welcoming, engagement, gender identity, care, intentionality, questioning, racism, being respectful, deconstruct the norm, equity, being vulnerable, integrity, fairness, designing for all, P-care. I've never heard that term before. Do I know that term?
No, that's just a typo. I meant to type care and the P went first and then I hit enter.
Oh, okay. Well, it's the big one. Yeah, care. Welcome. Okay, great. So does anybody want to mind sharing their answer? Why they make that connection?
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. This is Stephanie. I said intentionality. I think as I'm learning more about DEI and e-portfolios, but many other processes, right, and experiences, I'm recognizing how critical intentionality is to not just listen and learn, but to be really intentional in how things are built and communicated. So that's something that's I'm sort of on that path.
Thank you for sharing, Stephanie. Does anyone else feel open to sharing?
I put deconstructing the norm, just because I've been thinking a lot about how much of the work that we do is just kind of quote unquote the way it's always been done, and how it sort of serves to reproduce these systems of inequity.
Thank you, Megan. Is anybody else open to sharing?
Hi, it's Maureen here.
Right.
I wrote equity partly because my brain's not there yet. It's only 8 o'clock in the morning here. But really, it seems like a bit of a time-worn phrase, but for me, it's really important that everyone has the same opportunity. And when I look at all of the other statements, actually, for me, they all fit under that term equity, that we've got to remember that we're not just working for the median student, that we're actually working for all of the students that come to us.
Very true. Yeah, thank you, Marie. Yeah, I appreciate a lot of these. I'm seeing a lot of sort of both the practices that DEIBD might encompass, like care and questioning, intentionality, equity, and also some mindsets as well, which I think is also a helpful way to think about this. So, intentionality as a sort of mindset, engagement or welcome. I think also kind of are these sort of stances that we can take moving into this sort of work. Okay, so as we get started, we just want to lay down some ground rules for everybody here, and some agreements for a safer session. And so to begin with, everybody here is here to learn and challenge preconceived notions that they might have. We encourage everybody to listen without judgment, to be open to receiving feedback, to discuss an argument, not a person, and to keep what people share in breakout rooms confidential. We also encourage you, if you prefer, to change your Zoom handle if you would like to remain remain anonymous. Oh, I'm still going. I thought we were handing it over. So today we're going to go over a handful of things. So we will, Christina will give us an introduction to the principles, and then which I should say the digital ethics principles from the ABLE Digital Ethics Task Force, of which Christina and I are a part. We'll talk about the focus principle, which is the DEIBD principle, as you will guess by now. The example for today is one that comes from my own institution, Oxford College of Emory, and some of the various types of anti-racist work that are starting to percolate here at the institution, and what some of those effects have looked like on our ePortfolio assignment, the milestone. Then we have a number of activities where we will encourage you to engage with some of the assignment revisions we've done at Oxford to our milestone, to kind of give you a sense for what some of this work might look like, and also to what some of the challenges to this work might be. We'll think about some particular DEIBD strategies, and then what we're going to encourage you to do is to actually take a look at some sort of documents or processes or assignments at your own institution and imagine what applying the DEIBD principle would look like for you. And then finally, if you all, you all will want to access the materials for today, these options will be appear in the chat, but you can also take a look at this URL here, the tinyurl.com/DEIBD/feb/download. This will be important later on when we ask you to take a look at our Oxford milestone assignment. So be sure to keep this link handy.
Thank you, Peter, for this introduction, and welcome everybody who has joined us since the beginning of the session. We are really, really happy to have you here today. And it's actually not just Peter and I who are here from the task force, but also Sarah, Megan, Teresa, and Kevin. And this year, the task force, the 2021-2022 task force, consists of 10 members, with Megan Haskins, Megan Mice, and Sarah Zohelen being our co-chairs. And we are all from different organizations, as you can see, primarily, of course, from the United States, but we also have Christine Slade from Australia and me from Aotearoa, New Zealand, India. And the task force was formed in 2019 because ABLE had realized that there's a need to fill within the ePortfolio communities, and that digital ethics is an underdeveloped area of research and scholarship, as many of you probably know from your own research. And so making digital ethics a topic was important because it's also a rapidly changing field with all the new technologies, laws, and digital practices that change our landscape all the time. And of course, us working in that area and asking students as well as faculty and staff to work in that area, we do need to be mindful about these topics and also see how we can incorporate them. And so in 2019, ABLE saw an opportunity to advocate for ethically sound ePortfolio practices. And that's when the first task force was formed with 11 members, and we worked from September 2019 till the Northern Hemispheric summer of 2020, and then had our second year, and now we are in the third year. And in the first 2 years, we focused on the establishment of our 13 principles. And Sarah will be putting the link in the chat for you so that you can easily access them. In the first year, we worked on 10 principles, and in the second year, we tackled 3. And you might think, wow, that was not quite a lot of output for the second year. But really, the 3 principles we we investigated and researched in the second year seemed to be a bit more complex. And so they were diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization, what we are talking about today, visibility of labor, and evaluation. And so they do tackle quite large areas of investigation and therefore deserved a bit more attention. And of course, there was this thing called pandemic in many countries of the world as well that came into our working schedules. And so how are the principles actually structured? Well, we do have a statement to begin with that contextualizes the principle. And Peter, if you can please advance. Thank you. That gives an overview of what is being discussed in principle. Then we have a number of strategies that are designed to help work with that principle, work with that digital ethics practice. And these are accompanied by a number of scenarios. And those scenarios are written from a student perspective, faculty perspective, but also for those of us that actually work on ePortfolio platforms in order to showcase practices that could be employed or that you might want to consider or that you might have experienced yourself. And rounding up all of that is always a list of resources for further reading on the topic. And today, of course, as Peter already said, our focus is DEIBD. And that was the principle that predominantly Kevin Kelly, who was here today as well, and I researched last year. And it consists of 5 components: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization. But as this Venn diagram shows here, they are all interconnected. And that's why we didn't split them up in separate principles, but put them all in one. And many of you will have heard DEI or DEIB before. Those are very common abbreviations, but during our research, when we were interviewing a number of Indigenous scholars, we realized that decolonization actually deserves its own spot within that entire context, because there are certain elements that are just fundamental to that, and we didn't just want to kind of pull that into the other concepts, but really give it a prominent space and place in order to make sure that we are also considering that in our practices. And so before we look into kind of some of those strategies and familiarize you with that, we actually have a concrete example for you to go through, which will frame our conversation quite a bit today. And I'll hand back over to Peter to take us through that.
Sure. Thanks, Christina. The example I want to talk about today comes from my institution, Oxford College of Emory University, where we have introduced ePortfolio pedagogy fully to all of our students just this past year, although we've had pilots over the last few years. I'll speak a little bit in just a minute to some of what we've, some of the particular issues and challenges we've encountered through this process. Although I should first note that the Oxford College is a fairly unique type of institution. It is a 2-year college where our students graduate with an associate's degree, and a large number of them, I won't pretend to know how many, but we'll say 99% finish their 4-year degree at Emory College in Atlanta. Oxford is just 45 minutes east of Atlanta. Our students get an intensive liberal arts education in those 2 years, which is not the same as the sort of education that students get at Emory College, which is a little bit more tracked, for lack of a better term. And then we are also a residential college as well. So our students live on campus in this sort of small town environment. Our milestone program is new, it's very young, and our students work with their academic advisor, who's their professor for their first year seminar, And over the course of 4 semesters, we'll ideally be working with these reflective prompts to scaffold up this creation of an e-portfolio in the final semester called their milestone portfolio, in which they reflect on their growth as learners during their 2 years in college here. And actually, I don't know if I mentioned it, Oxford, this is important too, Oxford is a private institution too, so that also influences a lot of the sort of work that we do, and the work that we're able to do here it's a unique environment. So thinking about anti-racist work, we have started here with the assumption that higher education is a white supremacist system. So all that is to say, it's been higher ed in the university has been developed within colonial contexts in Europe and the United States that have deployed white supremacist practices like slavery, forced migration, segregation of people in education, redlining, etc. And white people also remain the dominant members of administrations and classroom instructors. A little tidbit that actually just came across the wire this morning, so I promise I will add it to our references on this slide. Our DEI report just came out here at Oxford, and still over 80% of our faculty are white, as an example of this issue. Administrators and faculty, therefore, in general, lack knowledge gained from life experiences of marginalized students, which then leads us to a place where most universities lack the tools, namely assessment tools, to address or even begin to be conscious of the institution's own participation in systemic inequities. So as an example of this, most traditional measures of institutional assessment, such as aggregated data on undergraduate completion rates, provide a picture. Like you see here, 60% of students in general in the United States graduate their undergraduate programs. The problem here is that this picture erases truly problematic data. So if we look at that same study, right, we can break that 60% down into a more disaggregated data set in which we see this traditional measure of success when, provided with an additional layer of scrutiny, shows that we have broken down by race, large disparities in completion rate in the United States higher education system, with Asian and white students graduating at a much higher clip and Latinx and Black students not even completing college at a much higher rate. All that is to say, we have many ways to also disaggregate data. McNair et al. Have made this point in their 2020 book from the AAC&U. We can disaggregate data, the sites of difference that we choose to measure. So for example, HBCUs might also look at gender as an intersectional point of analysis. Other institutions might find it productive to look at first generation students. Still others might look at students who attend part-time versus working full-time, right? There are a certain number of ways to take a look at how our students are performing and where they're struggling and where our institutions are failing to teach our students. At Oxford, we found that we could also look at different sources of data. So we have found a particularly unique source for exploring how our institution is perpetuating systemic injustice and inequities, and that is our students' voices within their own e-portfolios. So we could take a look at what we're doing here. We thought that our milestone assignment would be a great place to begin thinking about decolonizing our education. We have a certain amount of anti-racist work already happening here. It's very young. It's largely based in faculty development, our inquiry learning classrooms, which I'm happy to talk more about. And even the institution of the Milestone program was designed to address certain inequities. However, what we found is, I'm getting ahead of myself here. so we've thought with the milestone assignment that we can begin decolonizing work through programmatic assessment, also creating a culture of reflection, thinking about persistent revision of an assignment so that our assignments are never sort of stagnant, but are always addressing the individual students and our community's needs. And those are some ways that we've thought about the milestone as itself the beginnings of an anti-racist project. However, and this is kind of what spurred on some of this work. We've discovered some early problems with the milestone, which are going to point to some of the DEIBD principles that we're thinking of today. First, we found that our initial assignment encouraged students to craft what we consider heroic narratives, so that they are the assignment that was the projects that were excited by the milestone assignment tended to encourage students to think about themselves as people who succeeded in college, when that may or may not have been the case. We found that the assignment was encouraging students to complete work that maybe responded to a hidden curriculum, so that some students were receiving better marks if they created their portfolios in a particular way, and that those students were by and large they were not first generation students, and they were by and large white students. We found that our assignment lacked specificity, so students, and this is related to the previous point, kept guessing at what they were supposed to put into the assignment. There was an assumed academic norm of traditional academic writing that our graders were looking for when they were assessing the portfolios. And finally, we found that the assignment kind of assumed belonging at Oxford College, so that students who read the assignment felt that they needed to create a portfolio that showcased that they belonged at our institution, when we now know after revising our assignment that was not really the case. So we revised the assignment, and all of a sudden students were giving us narratives of not belonging as well. So particular problems with the milestone. With all of that, I don't know how much time we have for questions on this. I wasn't keeping track of time, but I'm open to any questions on our situation, the work that we're doing, before we dive into an exercise.
We are good on time, Peter. No worries.
Great.
So I'll jump in. You may have said this, I might have missed this. So this is an assignment, the milestone assignment is every student is completing this sort of at the completion of their program with you, or is it during their first year?
So it's a good question. It's actually, it's a bit of a bugaboo for me that the assignment, the creation of the portfolio only happens officially in the final semester. That's when students get credit. It's a pass-fail course. They get 1 credit for it, and they meet 3 times as they curate this portfolio in a cohort of students a cohort of advised students who started with them in their first semester and with their academic advisor. Ideally, the advisor who begins with these students in their first year seminar altogether works with those same students all the way through. One of the challenges we have early on is encouraging faculty to work with their students in those intervening semesters to do that reflective work. That is itself a challenge, but ideally the work happens all the way through the program, with the creation of the official creation of the portfolio happening in the final semester.
Gotcha, thank you.
Peter, could you say a bit more about the assumed belonging?
Yeah, I am also interested to see what you all think about this when you take a look at our first assignment. But we felt that that there was this desire for students to discuss their experience at Oxford in a way that that showcased how they were showcase kind of their positive reactions to all sorts of different clubs we have here on campus. So we have so many clubs. Every year there's more clubs. And that was a way for students to say, yes, I found community here at Oxford. And the narrative of finding community, we found through different work, through reactions to our new assignment, was actually a kind of a cipher for discussing resume building activities with clubs. And so there's sort of assumption that students felt like they need to talk about how they belong by the amount of clubs they were in. And the reality was they were actually feeling a lack of belonging because they were competing to get leadership roles in these clubs. So
a couple of those then, encouraged heroic narratives in curriculum, assumed belonging, maybe some of the others too. The issue is that the students, that you're getting the impression the students are telling you what you want to hear, in a sense.
Yeah, and the sort of thing they think that we want them to say about Oxford is that this is a place where there's community.
Okay, thanks.
Peter, we have a question in the chat. How many students were participating in the project, please?
Yeah, so we now have our first full cohort. So a lot of the observations that I've been giving you were from our pilot program. So we started out with one section of a dozen students, and we've now, and then we moved up to 40 students, and now we are with our first full cohort. Our students, or our student body is 1,000 students across 2 years. So it's a small school. And depending on whether or not students graduate early or in the spring semester, they'll participate in their final semester. And so we had 100 students participate last fall semester, and we have 400 roughly now. So, but it's everybody now. At this point, it is.
And another question, let's make that the last question before we go into the quiet reading, is what was the motivation for students to take this course or this module?
Yeah, so this is a thing, especially when we're talking about sort of like the sense at which students feel like they need to present a particular narrative. They early in the pilots, students signed up, right? So it was all voluntary. So these we may have expected would have been high achieving students. The work that was created with both the early assignment, the original assignment, and the revised assignment still showed students kind of with a sense of not belonging on campus, which was interesting. So even self-selecting students were saying, I struggled here at Oxford, socially or emotionally. So that's a question that we've wrestled with as we were running through the pilot of this program, for sure. But now it's everybody.
Okay, shall we continue?
Yeah, all right. So in the link to the resources for today's session, you all should have, you should see there 2 PDFs. So there's one entitled, I believe, original assignment, and then another one entitled revised assignment. These are just, from a Word doc, and includes these are the milestone assignments. What we're going to do is we're going to give you a chance for quiet reading, 8 minutes. And we have some questions for you as you engage with both the original and the revised assignments. You'll see them here. But as you read the original assignment, take a look at places where you feel language was used that made you feel like an outsider, right? So we noticed that many of our students felt like outsiders, and you as outsiders will hopefully also feel like outsiders, but we want you to note those places where you felt that way. As a kind of a 1B or 1A question there, think about what that might mean for our own students if they also feel like outsiders. The second question, what does the original assignment assume Oxford students' experiences look like? Maybe another way to ask that would be what's the sort of e-portfolio that these assignments want students to create, or what might students feel like they're expected to create. And then finally, which letters from DEIBD do you think this assignment needs to address most urgently? Diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, or decolonization. And then take a look at the revised assignment. So to what extent is this more transparent? It's a question I'm personally interested in because that's something I tried to do. And from your understanding, what sort of narrative does the revised assignment ask for? So take some time to look over those. And then what we're going to do is after you've done some quiet reading, we're going to like move you into breakout rooms so that you all can discuss these particular questions or anything else that came up.
Welcome back, everybody. Kind of judging from nobody coming out of the room early, we assume you had good conversations in your small groups. And now would very much like to hear from you if you'd like to share anything. And Peter, if you can please bring up the questions for the reading so that we have them in front of us. Yeah. Did you look at the original assignment, comparing it with the revised assignment? What are your findings? And please do feel free to either grab the mic or write in the chat, and we'll monitor the chat for that. Anybody want to make a start?
I'll make a start. So we thought when we were going through it was that the original assessment was not written for a student, whereas the second one was. We felt that the first one was written, it looked more like it was a lecturer talking to a lecturer as opposed to addressing the student. And we felt the second one addressed the student much better. And it made the ask much clearer. The ask in the first one was very unclear, whereas the ask in the second one we felt was much clearer.
Thank you for starting us off with that, Jonathan.
I hope my group won't mind.
We weren't eager to leave our group either. We were having a very good conversation. I don't want to speak for the group, but I will throw in a couple things that we were talking about, and that had to do with some wording, recursive artifacts. Make sure those are extremely clear, and they're more clear in the second one. But that was a one that we centered on. Another thing we ended on was the notion of leadership being a good thing, and especially in some of our areas where we have native cultures. I'm here in South Dakota, and leadership is from within a group. It's from, within, and that you don't set yourself out as being better than other people. That is very disrespectful to your community. And so even the notion of leadership being a good thing is not a given in all cultures.
One of the other things we felt too was that might be considered or made clearer is there room for notating where people have been unable to meet the challenges of the college and the community. It seems that this is all very much geared to people who are successful in their college years. What happens if somebody ends up at the end of the 2 years and they haven't been successful or they haven't been satisfied in their studies? There didn't seem to be anywhere where it says it's okay to talk about your disappointments as well as your successes. And then there was just one other thing too, is I think it's the assessment is trying to identify the growth in a person from the start to the end. That would be my reading of it. And if that's the case, then I felt it lacked a starting point, and that the first point of this thing should be that they need to write why they chose the course, what they think they're going to get out of the course, how they are at the beginning. And then you can then monitor through the portfolio how they've changed from that start point and how they're thinking. You know, if you maybe ask some questions at the beginning, which sort of identified their thinking at the start, and then you can then ask them to put together this portfolio, and you then be able to see at the end of the 2 years how that person has changed from the starting point. But it didn't seem to me to be anywhere where you're asking them, you know, notate on day one in your journal on your e-portfolio where you are and why you chose this and what you hope to get out of this program, you know, and then monitor it.
I'll jump in. I was the note taker for group 2, breakout room 2. And so some of the things that emerged in our conversation about this first question, one, the original assignment provoked the question, why do I need a change? And so that wasn't made clear. It wasn't basically building in the premise that people bring things to the table from their lived experiences and their backgrounds. So it was all about what happened while I was at the institution. And then we found a number of cases where it seemed to be making assumptions that students feel that they have peers, especially in that whole sense of belonging, that they feel they have changed, or that those changes were in the context of Oxford rather than maybe other things that they did at the same time as their school experience. Maybe something happened at work or internship or something that was co-curricular, that the moment deserves to be marked. We've felt some words were strong and maybe didn't necessarily fit every student's experience. Not every student would see it as a celebration. Some of the language like coherent and argument, again, may be limited in their appeal or meaning, and may even have an adversarial tone. And then even the idea, the opening line, framing it as an opportunity when it really amounts to a lot of work. And so students may not see it as an opportunity, they may see it as a requirement. And last, overall, that original assignment used language in places that might not be accessible or transparent for first generation students. So those were just some of the observations we made about the original assignment.
We didn't have note takers, so I want to really intentionally call out Maureen, Julie, Jeff, and Pablo to comment on the conversation that we were having about journey, and about the acronym. You know, we too kind of settled on B, but we settled there with feeling like it fit with some others too. So please.
Yeah, I think in our group, we tended to, for the most part, we did pick on B, belonging, but we also talked about the D for decolonization. And I think that relates to a lot of the talk that's already gone on, especially with regard to language and expectations. And Pablo in particular had some really good things. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Pablo, and see if you're able to share some of your thinking around decolonization.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Pablo Avila from New York, LaGuardia Community College. As I was reading both the original and the revised assignment, one thing that came out was this, it seemed to be framed around experiences and learning that happens obviously at the institution. And I was trying to look for opportunities for the student to reflect on things that may have been missing on their curriculum and how the student could look at his or her learning of the subject matter with a more critical eye rather than framing it within the boundaries of the curriculum. Also, something else that stood out for me is this idea of experiences. It spoke about artifacts, which may resonate as an assignment from a class, but I too was thinking about the experience that the student builds over time with peers, with professors, with other colleagues, and how those create a better sense of a curated experience that the student puts on the portfolio. Those two things resonated to me as decolonization and how the student can look at it from a critical eye rather than being framed within the boundaries of the curriculum that they experience. So those are two thoughts that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add on from that. And in the group with Kevin, we kind of got into that a little bit at the end, how the evaluation aspect of it, how to clarify for students that they aren't being judged, or it won't harm their grade if they mention negative experiences where things didn't work out, or as Pablo was saying, where they might be critical of the college. Sometimes students tend to think that if they get a lower grade, it's because they describe negative experiences or they didn't say what they were supposed to. But we want to make it clear that that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to say this in my group, but I must admit, having read both, I wasn't sure that the second one was a huge improvement. And I kept wondering why the instructions didn't just ask students to tell a story. You know, tell me about how things have been for you, and maybe use a couple of examples from assignments or work experience, or, you know, in much more simple language. For me, even the second one was still, they were asking for a story. Why not just say that? I mean, storying is something that goes across all cultures. We all know how to tell stories, and it just seemed like the language was still quite difficult in the second one.
And to build on that, yeah, we felt that in that answer to the question about what could be addressed further, the decolonization aspect could address different ways of knowing and learning, different knowledge traditions. And that, when you said the word story, it made me think of that as well.
I want to add in this as a little data point along the sort of anti-racist trajectory that I've been thinking here with these assignments. Just on these last few points that you all raised about the inability of the second assignment to say, just tell a story. That has been a bone of contention at our institution because a large number of faculty who needed to approve this as an assignment, for the whole curriculum, felt that e-portfolios weren't rigorous enough. And so there's a lot of diplomacy in this assignment in a way that I think a lot of classroom assignments don't have to deal with that sort of thing. And so the story language kind of floats in and out in order to get other words in there, like argument or account, or which then obscure the work for the student, right? And so it's it is part of this legacy of a white supremacist institution where the folks who work there and who kind of create the curriculum get to determine what it is or how the students kind of engage course material. So all that said, I'm just going to clip this and send it around to our whole campus. Anonymously, I'm going to block out my face and everything too. So
I think this our conversation now though shows really nicely what the intention was also behind why we brought up this example with you today that Peter had written about recently in IJEP, and of course is revising, that it is an iterative process. You saw the first original assignment, now you've seen the revised assignment. Now Peter and his team have gotten a lot of feedback from all of you here, which can then help them again to look at it, revise it, take it through another iteration, trial it again, and then see what other changes they might want to make and in different areas where to put the focus on. And it is that continuous improvement, kind of borrowing a little term from the technology area, kind of that agile working in an agile way on on the assignments rather than setting them in stone and having them there for 20 years. Because things are changing and we are changing our opinions and how we are thinking about topics and gaining more knowledge. More research is being done in that area. We are all getting more sensitive towards, well, what should we be taking into consideration? And I think this is a really, really nice example of that. Which kind of takes us also back to our DEIBD. Many of you have said that, of course, belonging was one important, or was the focal point in this, but also decolonization. And if you're reminded of the components of our digital ethics principle here, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization. And here we've just pulled out the strategies for each component of it. And they are all very exploratory. So find out for diversity, for example, and of course they overlap, as you can see from the Venn diagram. They are not really any hard boundaries, which might have also made it a bit harder on your end to decide which of the concepts is the most predominant one there. So for diversity, find out more about learners' identities, cultures, and their backgrounds. Create e-portfolio assignments that include resources representing those diverse perspectives, and ask students to cite diverse perspectives to support their work and really have that open mind. Under equity, and that is a lot of work that Kevin Kelly has done in particular over the last few years with Peralta Community College. They've even had a conference on the equity topic last year and also produced an equity rubric that I highly recommend you check out. There we have facilitate classroom conversations about presenting one's identity and addressing viewer biases, providing support and resources for students, educators, and staff to engage in e-portfolio activities, and encourage students to self-advocate when access and accessibility issues arise. So not just take things for granted, but also speak up. For inclusion, we have ask e-portfolio questions that encourage students to reference their backgrounds and give them space to self-select how much to share. Because when we have an assignment like, oh, tell us your story, students need to be aware that they do not have to share anything, not to have to share everything in case some parts actually cause them trauma. And so that needs to be made very clear. Review e-portfolio artifacts and reflections for use of slang and jargon that may exclude others. As we've heard from one of the group, the first assignment was actually more written for academics rather than for students. Simplify the language, make it more accessible. And ask students to create alternate formats that allow everyone to review their work. Belonging is now the big part where you'll see a lot of similarities to what you've discussed. Create a positive environment built on trust, form relationships with students, revise e-portfolio activities so students feel valued, accepted, and safe, and allow students to express themselves in ways that work for them while meeting the assignment requirements. And last but not least, decolonization. Include members of the learners' communities in the design of e-portfolio activities. Gain awareness of students' different knowledge traditions and worldviews as they impact e-portfolio work, and respect cultural concepts and norms from indigenous and other non-dominant cultures. So there are a lot of similarities that you've seen and that we can employ for the revision of the assignment even further in its next iteration. And with that, I'll hand over to Peter again.
Yeah, so we have an exercise for you all, and we're trying to recognize that you all come from different worlds, different roles within those worlds. We want you all to take this as an opportunity to practice some of this DEIBD work at your institutions. So what we'd love for you to do is to dig around in your computers, on the cloud, and find some sort of assignment. It could be an e-portfolio assignment or something else. If there's a particular part of a handbook, if any faculty here just want to destroy their faculty handbook, and administrative forms, something for if you have a professional development workshop, identify something along those lines, and then have you read back over that document and try to determine to what extent it addresses or raises DEIBD related concerns. I encourage you to find places where it actually addresses them and you're surprised, because maybe you're already doing that work as well. Something that maybe you started doing with response to like one particular student need or something that has just found its way to your work. Anyway, so make any changes to the document or celebrate those places where you've done that work. And then finally, reflect on any political pathways. So as we were just kind of discussing at the end, any political pathways or challenges to putting any of these changes into place within your context. So mark up that document. Really pretend like you have all the power to make this work, and see what comes of it. And we'll give you, I think we have 15 minutes on this.
So I'll call you back in about 15 minutes.
So feel free to turn off your cameras and your mics or put on soothing music. Does anyone want to share what they were working on? I think we could also permit screen sharing too, if y'all want to share what you've been working on.
Into our style guide and because we are currently piloting using ePortfolios with our FYS first year experience course, and some of the very things that were coming out to me from the one that we were reviewing earlier in the session jumped out in our own. So the notion of leadership, I'm realizing that echoes through many, many times. We've got to be very careful with how we present that, and that if we present it, that we leave it open to leadership and participation or something like that. So
yeah, and defining leadership too, that's something we're struggling with here, because we find that students have some definition of leadership, some people at our administration have definition of leadership, and then the people who actually teach leadership have a different definition of leadership, and it causes confusion, and there's also some of those definitions are harmful. What else were y'all working on?
I'm happy to share part of the screen. I'll just.
Sure.
So there's some other information that I won't share that's on other parts of the screen, but this probably gives you an example. This is actually part of a document that's shared with people who want to have a promotion. So for instance, from lecturer to senior lecturer, from associate professor to professor, etc. So this is not actually for our students, it's for our staff. I didn't write it, so I felt really comfortable knocking it to bits. The biggest issue I'm going to have if I want to change this is dealing with HR, human resources people. Apologies to any of you out there who may be HR people. They do have a different language and a different agenda perhaps to the rest of us at times. And I'm definitely going to have a go though. I struggle with this because part of my role is to actually support lecturers with the process of creating an ePortfolio. Most of them have never even seen one, let alone created one. A lot of our lecturers have come in from industry and were never actually teachers, so they haven't necessarily gone through a lot of academic experience. And the one thing that hit me between the eyes with this was the fact that it's actually quite punitive. It isn't very welcoming. It's all about, don't do this, you must do this. And you can't see them here because there's some people's names, so I've left them off the screen. But it's not until you get to the end of the second page that there's actually some information about who to contact if you want help. So some of the things I would change is to put the help and support information right at the beginning. I'd use language like "you are invited to," or "we would like to," and maybe supply a rubric to say how they're going to assess the portfolio, because they don't actually do that. And even as the person who supports the teachers, I don't even know what the panel is necessarily looking for. And I don't get feedback from them either about why people were successful. So I'm kind of leading people blindly, except that I must be doing something right because quite a few get there. But I'd also obviously provide things like there is a template that I've created, and I would make sure that that was clearly laid out, that actually there's a template that will just step you through the process. You don't need to know how to do this, etc. And just more kindness, which is something we talk about a lot in New Zealand at the moment, as we in yet another, not a lockdown, but another surge of the COVID. And it's not kind. And it's not supportive. And I think whether we're talking about academics or students, we need to be supportive and kind. And that's all about inclusion and decolonization and belonging. So it was interesting looking at this from that perspective. I've never felt comfortable with this document, and I've not really been able to put my finger on why. And now I do. So I would change quite a lot of this.
Thank you for sharing, Maureen. Kind of what jumps out at me in this document is also that it's quite a bit about the technology and not so much the content. And really just focusing on those factual things that should in a way be secondary and more stand out, kind of, well, what have you done in your teaching? Right?
I mean, it was also written by people who don't use e-portfolios. And it's interesting, that very top bit I take out too, because this was designed, this document was created as a transition from when they used to supply a ring binder of paper information to what's now a digital portfolio. And I would just take that out now, because people are struggling to do the translation if they've never actually had to do the 40-page version. They're not around anymore. So we should just forget that. But yeah, it's not relevant. There's quite a lot of stuff in here that needs changing. So thank you. It was really interesting to look at this.
You can remove Flash, because don't have to worry about that anymore.
Oh,
it's all
absolutely.
done.
I thought that too. I thought, gosh. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Maureen. I just am reflecting on the context that you're in, where you have non-academics teaching, people from industry, and then thinking about the sort of similarities for dealing with people with PhDs too, also need kindness and patience, and that's definitely transferable.
Yeah, and we do, and the same as we do with students who come from backgrounds where perhaps not everyone goes on to tertiary education. It's a challenge sometimes for these teachers to feel like they belong, because they've come in as, we're a polytechnic, so we have courses and qualifications in construction and plumbing, and as well as architecture and teaching. Like, there's the whole range, and those teachers often don't feel like teachers, and the struggle is always developing their identity of themselves. Thanks, Christina. I was struggling for the language that would be inclusive of everybody here.
Does anybody else want to share, maybe not as big a revelation as Maureen had gone through, but even something small that you might want to look into further?
I just put something in the chat. So I was looking at a couple of lines of a rubric. And I put them there. Is there evidence of creativity and effort in the portfolio? Is there evidence that student is using the writing processes as tools for learning and discovery to demonstrate integrated learning, higher order thinking? And I was thinking about how to rewrite that with DEIBD guidelines in mind, because the language it's in a rubric and they get scored, but it's quite subjective.
Is this a rubric that is given to the students?
Yeah. But there are no examples. They get a score for those. So those were 2 lines, and they would get a score 10, 8, 6, 4, and so on. But it doesn't give any examples of what would count in any of the categories.
Mm-hmm. Certainly when I've written portfolio rubrics, they tend to be quite developmental in that in the rubric, I actually put examples. So I might say you, and I always say you, or I have used a range of media, or this, I have, I can't think of anything else now, but yeah, so the examples I think is helpful if they're given to the students, if there are some examples on what that might look like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as I was reading it, Teresa, like it struck me that creativity and effort feel really subjective. As if, like Maureen said, if you gave examples of like the writing processes as tools for learning, that would help students identify that, like, oh, I used this writing process and I used this writing, like it would help them sort of pick out. So parts of it seem easier to transform than others.
Right, and I think that goes back to what we're saying, you know, writing in the language of instructors or institutions rather than students, because it's also language that appears in other learning goals, learning outcomes, and the students always have a trouble understanding, especially the first year students, what that means, writing as a process for learning and discovery.
Mm-hmm.
It depends too on the instructions given to the students. To see that, I would, for instance, be putting in instructions for the portfolio whereby I'd want to see students occasionally providing examples of maybe a first draft and a final draft, because that's the easiest way to see some of the change in understanding about writing. But often they find, and I find for my students with portfolios, they do want to present their best work, but sometimes I have to encourage them to say, actually, I want to see the progress. That's the progress that's important. It's not necessarily where you end up. And so it's hard, but getting them to learn to be brave enough to put in some of their early work and then some of their better work as they adapt and change things.
Mm-hmm.
So also what you said, Maureen, made me think, I kind of have a question for the group. So at our institution, in reference to the last question that you all asked, Peter and Christina, about the political pathways and challenges, we just had the opportunity, because the rhetoric and composition program, where students take their first 2 years of their writing courses, they are creating a new textbook, and it's going to be a digital all online textbook for students. So we had the opportunity to rewrite some parts, right? And so there were a few pages that were specifically about e-portfolios, and it mostly because nobody else was interested in doing it, we got the opportunity to kind of jump in there and rewrite those sections, which we found were really I don't know, somebody said it earlier, it was like they were written for the academic scholars thinking about e-portfolios rather than for students. But we were having the conversation about whether or not to use you, like as a way to address students. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to open it up for the group, because the argument that I had made, this was what I was rereading as we were talking here, like the argument I had made to the group was that we could use students when we were thinking, like when the sentence was addressing all students, and you when it was more directed towards like the individual student and the expectations of the portfolio. But this workshop has made me think, is you making too many assumptions about who we're addressing? I don't know.
I can certainly answer for myself, Sarah, is that I tend to do that. So when I'm writing about students, although the language here is changing now, we start to write about learners rather than students.
Okay.
And then I would use one of those two words. But certainly in something like a rubric that's going to be about a particular student's work, I personally tend to use you. Because I wanted them to start seeing right from the beginning that the assessment process, whether formative or summative, is actually a conversation. So the feedback that I give them on their portfolio, especially the formative work, they can actually come back and say, no, I don't agree, or you didn't quite understand why I did this. So for me, that's one of the reasons I use you. I think it's more inclusive and encouraging a conversation rather than saying, this is it. This is what you have to do. A bit like that horrible document I shared.
I wonder in some ways whether it might also be a bit culturally influenced, because I feel here in New Zealand there's quite a bit of informality in academia, but also businesses and other aspects of life. And so I personally also use you quite a bit in documents when I want to address the person and when I want to create closeness, rather than being very distant when you speak in the third person. But I don't think I've seen that much in German writing.
Right.
As
there's still,
Zealand,
I think even in New Zealand, Christina, I think there's still a sort of maybe a 60-40 split over whether that informality is okay in these sorts of circumstances. Certainly I do have issues with other teachers who say, no, you need to be more, you can't use you there. It doesn't sound important enough.
Right, that was such an eye-opening experience for me when I was in a diversity, equity, inclusion workshop, and we were talking about how academic English is a dialect, and just appreciating that no, it's not the winner. It's just one of the many, and it's the one we can choose to use in particular situations, but we need to not see it as a hierarchical thing, you know.
Yeah. Yes, I remember having a huge debate with my thesis supervisor over whether I could use I, first person, in my thesis, and eventually just told her I was going to do it because it was an interpretative method and I was interpreting the results through my lens. So it had to be I. It couldn't be third person, but there's still, a lot of, as you say, it is a dialect. And it's something we assume our students are okay with, and they might not be.
I've been here digging around for an article I remember reading, and I cannot find it yet. So you'll just have to take my word for it that it exists. But it was on using the first and second person in singular in syllabi. And one of the cases that sticks in my brain for why you should use the first person singular, I know this isn't the second person, but slightly different, but it increases your vulnerability as a teacher to say, I ask, I require, I invite. It puts you out there as somebody who can also be impacted by your students, and it encourages them to similarly become vulnerable in the learning space. And I do wonder if you does the same thing, if it's accompanied by an I. That's just some conjecture though. Kara, do you mind what telling us what you shared there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just came across Gallup some days ago where it was saying that a larger group of Gen Zs are identifying as non-binary or as some form of LGBTQ, and I really do think that I wonder if we just get around it by not using you or I at all and just focus it more on the objectives, evidence that shows, and maybe we just need to ask our students at that time in that particular cohort what their preference is. I know that means it's not personalized, but at least it can be personalized for that group in that cohort. Yeah. It is, yeah.
Yeah, I think, that is one of the places I end up feeling sort of stuck, right? Is when you're writing a document that has to be an institutional document. So it can't be personalized. It's a textbook for thousands of students. So, so personalizing and you at some point have to, well, you can say students repeatedly, or you have to introduce a pronoun of some form, right? And that's where that is where we kind of get stuck. So I think that, yeah, I totally see your point on like a course, like a class by class, like if you were working with students within a course, but I do wonder how you would apply that. Like, yeah, that's
I'm going to show my ignorance here because, I'm actually asking for someone to clarify for me. I'm unclear how I knew would be offensive to LGBTQ. There, I get that you want to try to use they as a nice singular and plural pronoun, now I totally understand that. But the IU, I don't see how that would be offensive. She, he, I get that. So someone clarify for me. I'm sorry for not realizing.
I'm not the spokesperson on this, and this might be my ignorance as well, but I just wondered if it's the assumption that if you're saying you're assuming that they are one identity, but if they feel that they are multiple identities, then they. But yeah, it's tricky. I'm not saying
no, I think you make a really good point, and I think that was one of my, Sharon, to go to your. There's an old textbook called, well, it's just been around for a while, it's still in existence, but Everything's an Argument, which is something that gets used I remember the first time I introduced that textbook to my students, and they use you, right? It's you this and you that, except that like one of the examples in the version I was using was about the Arab Spring, and it says like, you'll probably remember this and the social media, blah, blah, blah. Well, if the students didn't remember that, or they hadn't been engaged with that social media, they immediately felt stupid, like they'd missed some big social movement that they were supposed to know about, or like they weren't engaged in the work, like there was some expectation for engagement in social media that they hadn't participated in. So like the you was so broad as to be directed in a way that made them feel left out. And so that's kind of how I was thinking of the you. It's like, I wonder if it can sometimes, not be inclusive in that particular way. I don't know what fixes it either.
I agree, Sarah. But I think maybe it's about not having a definitive decision. Something I say all the time is it depends. Is it about actually being critical, thinking critically about what we're using? Because it's the context that really matters.
And that's probably a good stopping point for the moment. I hope we can pick up that conversation some other time. To briefly look back at what we've discussed today, and there was a lot of discussion going on in your small groups and then also in the larger group. And we've only been able to tackle a really, really small amount there of the IBD, and we'd very much like to invite you to continue that conversation with us, with the task force at your own organizations, and hopefully that short activity of the reflection on a document at your own institution will help you make that first step and see with whom you might want to discuss that further, see what changes you can make, and how you can influence digital ethics at your own institutions. And so where to from here? I'm going to post a whole slew of links into the chat so that you can grab them in one go via copy and paste. And the first one is to our feedback form, and we'll definitely also share the link after the session with you. And because this is the first workshop that we are running outside of a conference in the longer format, the 2-hour format, so we'd definitely very much like to get some feedback from you, what you're thinking, where things are at. And then we'd also like to invite you to our next webinars. The next one will be on the 11th of April or 12th of April for New Zealand, Australia, about evaluation. And after that, the 9th of June for support and practice. And of course, you're also very welcome to come along to the annual meeting for ABLE in July. It's actually happening across 2 weeks on the 14th and 15th of July and 21st and 22nd. Call for proposals are still open, and yes, there will be an online component. So that because not everybody will be able to go to Salt Lake City Community College in Utah. And if you'd like to engage further with the task force, we do have the link to the principles as well as our scholarship page where you can see presentations and also publications that we've been involved in over the last 2.5 years. And we look forward to hearing from you, and hope also to get some feedback on the principles from you if you'd like to contribute in any way. So thank you so much for coming today.